Hello, everyone. My name is Taylor, and this is Cozy Corner. Make sure you follow, like, and subscribe for more content as it drops. So now we are in part two. So we're going to go over chapter 3 and 4 of The Truth About Ruth. So without further ado, let's begin. So there was an interaction between Ruth and Boaz, which, if you read, Naomi gave detailed instruction on what she should do as it pertains to Boaz. So from 3, verse 1 through 8, you're starting from 9 through 13. There's a conversation between Ruth and Boaz, where Ruth was asking Boaz to redeem her. But he could not because he was not first in line to claim Ruth. Now, you all are asking, how is that? So there were customs and traditions then that they had to go before the elders in regards to inheritance and things like this. There was always someone. There was a chain of command that had to be followed. So Boaz was not the first male in line for Ruth. It's in scripture. So he said that if he does not redeem you, then I will, because Boaz would have been next. So if the first guy, which it doesn't mention his name, the Redeemer, that's just who they refer him to, if he did not redeem her, then Boaz would. So that's how that came into question. We're going to talk about that. Customs and traditions, keep that in mind, you guys. That's very important. So, as you see, there was a man before her, but the matters had not been discussed with the elders, which we'll get into chapter 4 on how that meeting took place and why the man in question, Redeemer, nearer than I, did not redeem her. But he kept taking care of her and providing according to the customs stated in Deuteronomy. It's something he had to do, right? He took the responsibility of Ruth, okay? Keep in mind, she's a widow. Customs and traditions on how to treat widows. We already talked about that. So we go into chapter 4. Chapter 4, everyone seemed to miss when the scripture breaks down details of how Boaz acquired Ruth. And everybody knows to acquire means to obtain an asset or object, people. It depends on whatever the inheritance was. Because Naomi was selling some land. She went back home to sell land. So we're going to get into that as well. So Boaz went to the gate and sat down, and the Redeemer, who Boaz has spoken of to Ruth in chapter 3, 12 through 13, came by and sat down with the elders of the city to discuss matters of Naomi's estate. Boaz has this conversation with the Redeemer about how Naomi was selling a parcel of the land that belonged to her relative Elimelech, which was Naomi's husband. So Boaz the Redeemer is related to Naomi's husband, Elimelech. So Boaz said, buy it in the presence of those sitting here, which was the elders, to be a witness. They had to have witnesses at that time to be able to claim any estate, okay? There was no mention of Ruth at this point of the story, so Boaz says, if you do not redeem it, I will, because I come after you. And the Redeemer said, I will redeem it. Okay. So, in here, as you see, the Redeemer said, hey, I'm going to redeem the land. Okay. But then Boaz says, the day you buy the field from Naomi, you will also acquire Ruth, the widow. Okay. So we talked about what acquire means. Ruth came with the land that was in question. So Ruth was the package deal with the portion of the land in question. Now, the reason being is Ruth was going to be the one to preserve the name. Okay? So, of the family. So she had to be the one to carry on the name through her legacy, having the children, things like that. That was the customs then, ladies. It was more so about the legacy. That was the customs in Scripture. Okay? So, he said, in portion of the land in question to perpetrate, to preserve, that's what that means, the name of the dead and his inheritance. So it all came together. Okay? So we're getting into that point where now it's coming to the question of how Boaz is coming up in it. Now, in those customs and traditions, if you did not have children, you always had to, there was this question of marrying next to kin and things. We're not going to get into that because that's too much to have to break down to you all at this point. We can get into it if y'all want me to do a study on that and talk about that, but we're not going to do that today. We're just going to stick to Ruth. So remember, Ruth did not have children. That's why the statement was made by Boaz. Now, when the Redeemer realized he could not, because that would impair, which means to ruin or destroy, lessen the value of what was rightfully his inheritance that he had already was supposed to come into. He could not redeem the land and Ruth, so Boaz was left to do so, and he did. So the Redeemer must have been the eldest, which is why he was the first in line and didn't want to accept the offer because the inheritance he had was greater than what Naomi was offering as the inheritance for the estate of her husband. So chapter 4, 7 through 11 speaks about how transactions had to be made and they had to have witnesses, which was someone in high regard to participate in these situations. Boaz took Ruth as his wife to perpetrate, remember we talked about that, the name of the dead and the name of, and so that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and native place. That was the traditions and customs at that time. Keep that in mind. The important part people also missed was the elders stated about Ruth being like Rachel and Leah, who built the house of Israel. If you remember Rachel and Leah's story, reference Genesis 29, for those of you who have not read it, and how they had a vital role in the lineage of the house of Israel. And Ruth bore Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. So you all see why it was so important. So when you read the story in context, you understand that the story of Ruth and Boaz is not as glamorous as society makes it seem. A whole lineage was saved as a result of Ruth and Boaz's union, which at that time was more important than anything else you may have been taught to believe. It is also important to read these stories in context, because when you do, you realize that Ruth may not be the character you're playing in your story of life. So in reading this, that is why this story is about a widow and not about single women desiring marriage. This was about a woman that was childless and didn't have a husband, and she ended up marrying Boaz to preserve the lineage and to be able to bring about David, which at that time, that was more important than anything else. So next time you read that story, read it in context. And I pray that something that I said has opened your eyes to realize that even though the story of Boaz and Ruth don't apply to you, there are other stories with women that could apply to your life in many different ways. So you all have a great day. This is Taylor with Cozy Corner. Thank you for tuning in.